Thank you very much for this very nice introduction. I nearly feel as a member of the TAP in the meantime, because I've been on these wonderful places a lot of times. And today I want to speak about the possible role of inflammation in Alzheimer's disease. And I want to start with some historical remarks, because I am coming from the Munich hospital where Alzheimer worked and where he discovered this disease. It's around 110 years ago that he published his work on a so-called a peculiar severe illness process of the cortex, ein schwerer, eigenartiger Erkrankungsprozess der Hirnrinde. And Emil Kraepelin, he was at this time the head of the department. We have already heard today about Emil Kraepelin. He is the one who classified psychiatry into the classification which is still more or less until today, because he described or he classified the psychosis, on the one hand the manic depressive illness, and on the other hand dementia praecox. Dementia praecox is a concept which is a bit different from the concept of schizophrenia, which was described the first time from Bleuler, who had the same teacher in psychiatry as Kraepelin. So both described, both were very important for the history of psychiatry and especially for the concept of dementia praecox, but also for the affective psychosis like the manic depressive illness. It was a quite fruitful collaboration between the hospital here on a boat trip at the Starnberger See, which is a lake outside of Munich. This is Alois Alzheimer, this is Kraepelin, and this is Robert Gaub. Gaub developed, or he was the first who described or developed the concept of so-called psychogenic psychosis. And this is Franz Nissl. Franz Nissl developed the so-called Nissl staining. It is used until today, and he was a kind of methodological pioneer at these times, because without this Nissl staining, it would not have been possible to detect the Alzheimer's disease. Let me shortly say some words about Alois Alzheimer. He was from Bavaria, born in Franconia, studied medicine, and then he was over 15 years assistant in Frankfurt at a community hospital. Before he was very interested in science. He went to Kraepelin, who was at this time in Heidelberg as a professor of psychiatry, before he came to Munich. And Alzheimer went with Kraepelin to Munich. Here he was senior psychiatrist, but mainly he ran the neuropathological laboratory. And in 1912 he went to, or he followed the call to Breslau as head of psychiatry, but 2.5 years later he died in Breslau, today in Poland, in Wrocław. just to illustrate the fruitful collaboration on at the Alzheimer laboratory, this is Alzheimer and his team and guest researcher. This is Alois Alzheimer. This is, for example, Fritz Levy. Levy was the first to describe the so-called Lewy bodies or Lewy body. And you know that there's a special kind of dementia called Lewy body dementia, but Lewy bodies also play a role in Parkinson's disease. And there, for example, were Italian guest researcher Perosini, who also worked on Alzheimer's disease, and he introduced this concept in Italy and worked together with Alzheimer quite fruitful. And at that time also Cerletti was in the Munich group. I'm not sure whether this is Cerletti or not, but he is the one who introduced the electroconvulsive therapy in psychiatry later. But others, for example, who worked as guest researchers were Creutzfeldt and Jakob. I think you know the Creutzfeldt-Jakob disease. It's a so-called prion disease. These two described this the first time. And for example, another one was Konstantin von Economy from Austria, who described the economoencephalitis, the so-called, or the brain disease of the so-called Spanish flu. And this was an epidemic in 1918, who was described by von Economo. Alzheimer in 1907 described this disease. I mentioned before during a congress, and he studied the patient, the first patient in Frankfurt, but then he went to Munich and the patient died in the Frankfurt hospital and the brain was transferred to Munich. And these are these kind of stainings who are still existing today. And this, for example, is the Nissl staining of these tissue sections of these first Alzheimer patients. The hallmarks of Alzheimer's disease, as you all know, are on the one hand the amyloid plaques, plaques of amyloid deposits in the brain, and on the other hand the so-called tangles, which are in the nerve cells. This is an original drawing of Alzheimer, who described the ongoing destruction of these neuronal cells in different stages. This is an early stage of the disease. This is a middle stage of the disease, and this is the last stage of the Alzheimer disease, and the tangles you can see here, intracellular tangles. And what are these tangles? The intraneuronal formation of these tangles is a hallmark of Alzheimer's disease, and they consist of this hyperphosphorylated tau. You know that the tau and phosphotau are the diagnostic markers used today, not especially for Alzheimer's disease, but for neurodestruction. And for example, if you inflame the tissue, for example, with lipopolysaccharides, with an inflammatory, who makes the inflammation, and you induce the inflammation with LPS, then you can increase the tau pathology. So that's one of the findings. What what has inflammation to do with the tau pathology? The increased tau pathology is most probably driven by the increase of pro-inflammatory cytokines, for example, for interleukin-1 beta, which is a part of the innate immunity. And also, you know that another hallmark is the apolipoprotein A beta, and this also induces neuroinflammation. The microglia activation and inflammation in an animal model, the surroundings of these plaques are activated microglia and activated astrocytes, both a kind of inflammatory cells within the brain. And interestingly, for example, indomethacin, but also dexamethasone, that means anti-inflammatory substances, they reduce these activated microglia. To come to the neuroinflammation in a more general way, what are the mechanisms of the immune system, which is a system in the peripheral part of the body, and the CNS? On the one hand, we know that there is an active transport of cytokines. Cytokines are the transmitters of the immune activation but also deactivation, and these cytokines are actively transported into the central nervous system. On the other hand, we know that within the CNS there are always permanently circulating immune cells, including, for example, macrophages. There is a part of the brain, the circumventricular organs, which lack this blood-brain barrier. That means there is no barrier between the immune system and the brain, and this is especially localization. On the other hand, there's another way, that afferent neurons of the vagus nerve can also activate cytokines in the brain, and brain cells, especially the microglia cells, but also astrocytes, they can produce those kind of cytokines within the brain without coming from the peripheral blood. And we know that in certain types of psychiatric disorders, there is a disturbance of the blood-brain barrier. For example, in schizophrenia, around 1/3 of the patients have a disturbed blood-brain barrier. Also, in Alzheimer's disease, this disturbed blood-brain barrier is always a sign of inflammation. This is a schematic drawing showing that from the peripheral blood, those cells, immune cells, such as, for example, T cells, B cells, but also macrophages, can invade into the brain through the blood-brain barrier under certain conditions. But, for example, here in the choroid plexus, there is no blood-brain barrier, and they can invade into the CNS much easier. So what has all this to do with the Alzheimer's disease? And with the question whether Alzheimer's disease is an inflammatory disorder or not, and I will come to one aspect, which role plays the immune system, the healthy immune system, for cognition. And there's, for example, one very interesting study showing in mice, in an animal model of mice which have a severe immunodeficiency. That means the maturation of the immune system of the T cells is disturbed, and I don't want to go into too much details here, but especially these T-cell deficient mice, they showed poorer learning compared to wild-type mice. That means learning is not so easy for them. They also forgot faster what they have learned compared to the wild-type mice. But this substitution of these T cells into these SCID mice increased the performance, the cognitive performance. That means especially that the intact T cell immune response is needed for the intact cognitive performance. And we, for example, know that the T-cellular immune response over the age of about 25 years, it's more and more aging, and it's more and more coming to a deficiency of this immune system. There's another interesting study, the so-called Maastricht aging study, which was performed in healthy probants, not in dementia patients, and there were applied several cognitive tests like the auditory verbal learning test, letter digit coding test, and different markers of inflammation were measured. The interleukin-6 receptor, the C-reactive protein, what's the most general marker for inflammation, haptoglobin and albumin. And 3 and 6 years later, these patients or these healthy elder people were studied again, and interestingly, there was a high levels of haptoglobin correlated significantly negatively with the course of the cognitive abilities, and the high CRP also correlated significantly negative with the course of the cognitive abilities. That means higher signs of inflammation or higher inflammatory markers were associated with less cognitive abilities not in demented people, in healthy elder probants. And there are, in the meantime, further studies showing more or less similar results. For example, the so-called Whitehall 2 study, where in London prospectively 4,200 persons were studied, and here also again the inflammatory markers, the CRP and the interleukin-6 were measured prospectively, and 7 and 12 years later again cognitive tests were performed. And these were also not demented patients, it was an occupational cohort study. And the outcome of this study was that raised levels of the inflammatory markers in midlife are moderately associated with lower cognitive study and little, a bit, not too much, with cognitive decline. But in these middle-aged persons, you don't normally see this cognitive decline. You have follow-up longer, and this is performed still in this ongoing study. Inflammation, neuroinflammation, there are, of course, several points which have to be discussed here, and of course, as you all know, infection in most times or very often is the basis of an inflammatory process, and therefore, of course, also the burden of the infections in the relationship to the cognitive function is interesting in this context. And there's just one example in a study of more than 3,000 participants, also healthy participants in New York, an age over 40 years when they were enrolled in the study, and there was defined a so-called infectious burden consisting from infection and titers of chlamydia, pneumonia, Helicobacter pylori, cytomegalovirus, herpes virus. And the cognitive status was assessed with the mini-mental state examination, as you know, which is very often used in dementia. And the outcome was that a higher infectious burden index was associated with lower mini-mental state examination. And even after adjusting for other risk factors, there are still nearly significant results. And this was also, there was after that a follow-up with telephone interviews, and there was a significant association of the infection burden and the cognitive status. And most contributes not the bacterial infection in this study, but the viral burden of the cytomegalovirus and herpes virus to this relationship to cognitive decline in cognitive function. Therefore, it is discussed now since several years that there might be a link between microbial infection and cognition, and some even go further and ask, is the microbe dementia hypothesis finally ready for treatment trial? Inflammation and Alzheimer's disease is a topic since many, many years, and there are big groups now looking for this relationship. And when we look to the risk factors for the development of Alzheimer's disease, of course, we all know that the most important risk factor is aging. That means people with 90 years have a risk of about 50% to get demented, but there are some more risk factors which are well known, for example, the brain trauma, but also oral health. That means oral inflammation might also play a role. We know that genetic factors play a role, but also infection or systemic inflammation is a risk factor, as I have shown. Midlife obesity and reduced physical activity, all these are risk factors for the development of Alzheimer's disease. And what is the possible role of the cytokines in the pathogenesis of the Alzheimer's disease? This is an example with the astrocytes, but also with microglia. It's very similar. An activation of the immune system, and for example, NF-kappa B plays here a role for interleukin-1 beta, as I have shown before. NF-kappa B is also plays a role for other pro-inflammatory cytokines like interleukin-6 or TNF-alpha, which leads to tissue destruction and, for example, to these neurofibrillary tangles. But we also know that the amyloid beta deposit plays a role for the amyloid plaques, and it is also related to the reduced cognition. This is an example for or the classification of the immune system. We have, in the one hand, the so-called innate immune system. This means the first barrier where the monocytes, macrophages play a role, but also the NK cells. And this is the adaptive immune system. This is a part of the immune system which is learning and which has a memory and which memorizes, for example, pathogens and react in a fast way after learning the T and B cells and also the antibodies. And the cytokines, for example, interleukin-6, TNF-alpha, they play a role mostly for the innate immune system, a lower role of in the B cells, but also here they are working. There are several studies showing that these pro-inflammatory cytokines play a role. For example, the stimulation of lymphocytes from patients with Alzheimer's disease, they produce higher amounts of these pro-inflammatory cytokines like interleukin-1 beta, interleukin TNF-alpha, and the IL-10 is an anti-inflammatory cytokine which is higher regulated to regulate down the immune response. But also, for example, the cerebrospinal fluid levels of interleukin-1 beta and TNF-alpha are also higher in patients with Alzheimer's disease. And even in brain probes, there is an overexpression of these pro-inflammatory cytokines, which mostly comes from cells from the innate immune system. That means from monocytes and macrophages. What has this to do with the memory? We know that, for example, the TNF-alpha has detrimental effects on the memory. We can see it in animal models. There in mice showing an overexpression of the TNF-alpha. They have more difficulties in learning. If you inject in animals the TNF-alpha intraventricular into the brain, there are more problems in learning and in memory. Also, if you inject it in the hippocampus, of course, these are important results, but of course, partly, as mostly in science, these are inconsistent, possibly dependent from the age. And you know that dementia is a disease of older age. Similar findings you can see with the interleukin-6, also here both in animal models, but also in patients. There have been results showing that an overproduction of interleukin-6 is also associated with an impairment of the cognition. On the other hand, the anti-inflammatory cytokine IL-4 regulates learning and memory. Those mice who are deficient for interleukin-4, they have cognitive deficits, but if you transfer the interleukin-4, and especially T cells in this study expressing interleukin-4, then you can reverse this cognitive impairment. So I don't want to go too much into details here, but of course these results are in the meantime quite consistently that the inflammation increases the risk for Alzheimer's disease. There's one big Danish nationwide register study who looked for the relationship between the history of infections and the cognitive abilities in patients. Involved in this register study were more than 160,000 data from more than 160,000 patients, all men, which were tested for the army, for the Danish army. That means in an age of around 20 years. And the cognitive abilities were tested on logical, verbal, numerical, and spatial reasoning. And second, the hospital contacts due to an infection were registered. In Denmark, every hospital contact and a diagnosis is registered, and on the basis of this register you can do those kind of epidemiological studies. For example, in Germany and many other countries, those kind of registers are not allowed due to data protection, but the Danish have this register, and therefore they have very interesting results. The outcome was, and I will go in more details here, that a prior infection was associated with a significantly lower cognitive ability in these young 20-year-old healthy men. And what were the factors? The cognitive ability was affected at most by the temporal proximity of the last infection and by the severity of the infection. Severity was measured by the days of hospital admission. And there was a significant dose-response relationship. That means the number of the infections was associated with a decreased cognitive ability independent from the type of the infection. Showing this, if you have, for example, one infection, you have a risk or you have a lower cognitive ability, but if you were admitted, for example, for 2, 3, 4 or 5 or more infections, which with every new admission to the hospital, the risk for the decrease of the cognitive ability increased. And this is an interesting dose-response relationship between the infection and cognition. So I already mentioned the pathological mechanisms of inflammation in Alzheimer's disease. The LPS model increases also the accumulation of amyloid precursor protein. What is the protein which later makes the amyloid deposits, and also the A-beta in transgenic mice, and also the exacerbation of tau pathology can be induced by pro-inflammatory stimuli on the one hand, and on the other hand, the efflux of these amyloid A-beta from the brain. There are 2 risk factors with the amyloid beta. On the one hand, the production of the amyloid beta and the deposit, and on the other hand, everyone from us produces amyloid beta, but normally there is an efflux again from the brain. And in Alzheimer's disease, this efflux of the amyloid beta is disturbed. I already mentioned the microglia. Microglia come from the yolk sac, an embryogenic cell type being within the brain, but on the other hand, monocytes, macrophages, monocytes are converted and activated into macrophages, and these can come through the blood-brain barrier as resident macrophages into the brain and have more or less the same function than the microglia coming from the yolk sac within the brain. And also here, the beta amyloid can activate the microglia, and the activation of the microglia is associated with an increase of these pro-inflammatory cytokines and with increased neurotoxicity. Already Alzheimer, in his first publication in 1907, has written about the glia. Here in the glia hat reichlich Fasern gebildet. That means it's an activation of the glia. I don't want to go too much into details, but I have to mention the cyclooxygenase 2. Cyclooxygenase 2 is an enzyme. You know that cyclooxygenase 1 and 2 play a big role in inflammation, and in the brain, the cyclooxygenase 2 is expressed without former activation. That means that it's expressed constitutively in certain areas of the brain, here in the hippocampus and in the amygdala, and it's only expressed on the brain without being further prior activated. It also plays a role in the pathology of Alzheimer's disease. For example, if you measure the cyclooxygenase 2, it's 80% higher protein levels of the cyclooxygenase 2 in the frontal cortex of Alzheimer patients compared to controls. And there is also an increase of the COX-2 expression in the hippocampus of the Alzheimer patients. And the cyclooxygenase 2 also is activated by prostaglandin E2, and both the prostaglandin E2 inflammatory marker, prostaglandin E2, and cyclooxygenase 1 and 2, and the expression of these markers, the overexpression, are associated with an impairment in learning and memory. And for example, if you inhibit the COX-2 with the COX-2 inhibitors, and you know that the anti-inflammatory medication are inhibitors normally of the cyclooxygenase 1 or of the cyclooxygenase 2, or most are inhibitors of both of 1 and 2. And the so-called modern aspirin, for example, are the selective cyclooxygenase 2 inhibitors like the celecoxib, for example. And the inhibition of the COX-2 attenuated the memory loss which was induced by COX-2. for example, if you induce it by intraventricular administration of A-beta protein, also in genetic models, but also with activation of the lipopolysaccharides injected in the peripheral blood or directly in the brain. These all can inhibit it with the COX-2 inhibitors, and it attenuates the loss of the memory. And therefore, I will show some of the results of the so-called non-steroidal antiphlogistics. These are mostly inhibitors of COX-1 and or of COX-2. Interestingly, there was a comparison post-mortem of persons which used or used not chronically those non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs. They had about the same, the findings in the brain were that there was about the same numbers of these amyloid plaques and of the neurofibrillary tangles, but the use of these drugs was associated with a significantly lower number of the activated microglia cells. That means lower inflammation. And interestingly, there are clinical results from a lot of clinical studies in the meantime. These are already older data, but also, for example, 7 studies from patients with arthritis, 2 studies from patients with rheumatoid arthritis, case control studies from the use of non-steroidal antiphlogistics, and here also, or with steroids. And the interesting outcome was that in all these studies, the risk for developing Alzheimer's disease was reduced. That means these non-steroidal antiphlogistics, they reduce the risk for Alzheimer's disease. And if they reduce the risk, that means if they protect from the development of dementia, Alzheimer's dementia, there's also a question whether they also act therapeutically. That unfortunately is not the case. On the one hand, we know that a use of at least 2 years is required to chronic use of these non-steroidal antiphlogistics to diminish the risk for dementia. And the older the people are, the less is the effect, the protective effect of these NITs. It is more pronounced in those persons who carry the risk gene, the apolipoprotein E4 gene. And it seems also that the protective effects are related to the inhibition of the cyclooxygenase. And there are certain non-steroidal antiphlogistics, especially the ibuprofen, the indomethacin, who have lower levels or produce lower levels of the A-beta independently from the COX inhibition. That means one mechanism protecting from Alzheimer's disease seems to be the inhibition of the cyclooxygenase, but it seems to have also a direct effect on the A-beta 1 to 42 protein. Pilot studies with indomethacin and diclofenac. Indomethacin is a COX-1 inhibitor, diclofenac, the mixed COX inhibitor, suggest benefit in mild to moderate Alzheimer's disease, but in these studies there was a high dropout rate related to gastrointestinal problems. You know that one of the risks of COX-1 inhibition is gastrointestinal bleeding. The celecoxib, rofecoxib, which are selective COX-2 inhibitors, they showed no therapeutic effects. And a study of ibuprofen showed no overall effects on cognitive and clinical outcome, but also here they showed positive effects on the ApoE4 carriers compared to the non-carriers of these ApoE4 genes. And it seems that the protective and the therapeutic effects of these NITEs are dependent from the timing of the intervention, from the duration of the treatment, from the dosage, drug class, etc. But more or less, the protective effect of this anti-inflammatory treatment is well shown, but it seems more or less no therapeutic effect, at least in moderate or in severe Alzheimer's disease, possibly a difference in very, very early stages of Alzheimer. If we look to neuroimaging and to the positron emission tomography, you know that you can look for inflammatory markers, that the PK marker and also the PBR28 markers are markers for neuroinflammation. And there are studies showing that here for the PK 1195, healthy and Alzheimer's disease, there is an activation of the microglia and the neuroinflammation, and the same with the other marker compared to the healthy control. So that means also from neuroimaging studies there are coming arguments that neuroinflammation plays a role. What about genetics? We know some risk genes about Alzheimer's, for Alzheimer's disease, and there are data showing that the immune system or genes of the immune system are involved in Alzheimer's disease. For example, you know that all these immune markers, most of the immune markers are according to the CD classification cluster of differentiation. 33 is an immune marker, but also I will go here into more details. The TREM2 plays a role in the TREM1 and TREM2 plays a role in the immune activation. And these are genes of the innate immune system which play a role in Alzheimer's genetics. Especially interesting is this so-called TREM2, the triggering receptor expressed on myeloid cells and the risk for Alzheimer's disease. I don't want to go into too much details here, just showing that this risk gene is related to the production of this molecule here in the cerebrospinal fluid. And this is the clinical onset of the Alzheimer's disease. And you see that, for example, for the TREM2, already years before, here nearly 20 years before the onset of the clinical symptoms of Alzheimer's disease, you see an increase of the TREM2 molecule. You also see an increase of the tau in the CSF and an increase of the A-beta disposition. These are all risk factors, and you see that the start of the pathology of Alzheimer's disease is decades before before the first clinical symptoms, and therefore possibly these TREM2, for example, can be a marker for the disease progression. We know from the A-beta disposition and we know from the tau pathology that they are risk factors for Alzheimer's disease and are involved in the pathology of Alzheimer's disease. Looking to familial and sporadic forms of Alzheimer's disease, it seems that, especially as I mentioned before, these hereditary forms of Alzheimer's disease, and the most well-known and the most well-examined are the presenilin 1 and 2 families, but these are there are only very few of the Alzheimer patients which are positive for this presenilin, but this is a kind of genetic model for Alzheimer's, but only less than 5%, only I think 1 or 2% of the Alzheimer's positive are these presenilin positive. But these forms, by gene mutations encoding APP production, are associated with an increased production of the amyloid beta, and the sporadic cases, at least the majority of the sporadic cases of Alzheimer's disease, the non-hereditary cases, they seem to be the impaired clearance mechanism which plays a role for the disease process. I don't want to go into too much into details regarding the tryptophan-kynurenine metabolism. It's quite complicated and time is running. Just to say, this metabolism of the tryptophan, which plays a role, for example, in depression, but also in psychosis, and it seems also in neurodestruction, neurodegeneration, and in dementia, because tryptophan is degraded, for example, to serotonin, and you know that it plays a depletion, plays a role in depression, also the melatonin, but this 3-hydroxykynurenine, this is a neurotoxic metabolite, and I tell this because it's all related to inflammation, because inflammation runs the prostaglandin E2, but also pro-inflammatory cytokines are responsible for the activation of these enzymes which, for example, produce the 3-hydroxykynurenine. And I just want to show that this 3-hydroxykynurenine plays a role in neurodestruction, and this is a study we performed some years ago, that here in Alzheimer's disease there's an increased level of this toxic metabolite 3-hydroxykynurenine compared to patients with depression and also patients with schizophrenia. So it's these tryptophan metabolism and the neurotoxic effects within this metabolism, which is induced by inflammation, is also related to Alzheimer's disease. I don't want to go here into details regarding the 3-hydroxykynurenine kynurenine. Just let me summarize. We know that the decline in cognition is related to the inflammatory cytokines, and I showed this study with this infectious index in healthy people is associated with memory impairment. That means also in healthy people, inflammation contributes to a decline in cognition. An intact T-cell immune response is needed for an intact cognitive performance. Pro-inflammatory cytokines have a negative impact on the cognitive state. And in Alzheimer's disease, we have a pro-inflammatory immune state. The deposit of amyloid beta and the tau pathology are hallmarks of the Alzheimer's disease, already described by Alois Alzheimer 110 years ago. Both are related to inflammation. We know that the microglia activation plays a role in Alzheimer's disease. We don't know whether the activation is a result of the deposit of the amyloid or it is a pathological mechanism itself. But there are arguments that the inflammation and the microglia activation plays a big role in the pathology itself. We know, for example, that the history of infection increases the risk for Alzheimer's disease in a dose-dependent way. The neuroimaging, especially with the PET, points to an inflammatory pathology. The immune-related genes are risk genes for Alzheimer's disease. The increased toxic metabolites of the inflammation-driven tryptophan-kynurenine metabolism is found in Alzheimer's disease, and the anti-inflammatory drugs reduce the risk for Alzheimer's disease, but unfortunately they don't show a therapeutic benefit, which seems to have to do with the fact that when the first clinical signs of Alzheimer occur, then you have already, or the patients have a history of 10 or 20 or even more years of neurodestruction before. Thank you very much for your attention.